Just finished having a conversation with my friend and historian Mike Jones about the effect of World War One on masculinity, and it has to be one of the most moving Thursday for Knowledge that we've done so far. We talked about the effect of the broken promise that we made to young men in that war, and also the very real effect it had on his family life and on him, the effect that it still has on our society now. As I say, really moving, a lot of very useful information in there, especially around the importance of men to not only acknowledge the dark parts of themselves, but also the golden parts of themselves. And that goes for us as how we look at our society and how we look at our history. Yes, we've done some terrible things. Yes, there's been brutality in it. Yet there has been moments of beauty within it also. Have a look, see what you think. Take care. Bye. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Laurence. Everyone who's watching this, welcome to Thursday for Knowledge. And this week I've got Mike Jones here, who, as well as being a dear friend of mine, is a author and a military historian. Is that the right way to put it?
Historian is better.
Just historian.
Fair amount of hysteria in it.
Okay, and so let's get straight into it. So those of you watching at home, you know that this is Thursday for Knowledge, and every week on Thursday for Knowledge, we ask someone interesting to come along to look at a different aspect of masculinity or men's well-being, or around areas which have had effect on either of those areas. And that's the context in which Mike is here today. I'm Laurence Jones. You all know me, and hopefully you're part of the Magnificent Man Project group, which is a Facebook group which encourages men to come together and to connect with each other, to challenge with each other, to contribute to each other's lives and the lives of others, and to celebrate each other. So if you're not in it, do get in it. So Mike, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself now, because as we've already seen, you're going to do a much better job of it than I do.
Okay, well, Laurence, it's great to be with you again, because we did this together at the Union Chapel a while back. That was to do with the anniversary of the ending of the Great War. So it was November 2018. And I'm a military historian. It's kind of fascinating, the labels to introduce oneself. So I'm a military historian, and I'm an author and tour guide. So I've written 14 books on war, ranging from the Middle Ages through to the Falklands. I've worked a lot with veterans, particularly World War II, particularly Red Army veterans, and also Falklands veterans. But what's really bringing me here, I mean, there's knowledge and there's also personal experience. My personal experience, my family on my mother's side was devastated by the experience that I never knew my maternal grandparents, and my dad's parents were a huge influence on me. They were always present and very supportive. But when I was born, my mom had lost her mom and her dad by the age of 18. She'd lost both of them. And little fragments of that story I started to piece together. My mom was profoundly alienated from her father. And that wound, deep wound, I realized after a period of time, impacted very strongly on my mom's relationship with me and men. So she associated a lot of, the negative aspects, if you like, of masculinity, or unhealthy masculinity with men in general, addiction, drinking, violence, and she really had hardened her heart against her dad. And what was really devastating was that she lost her mom first, and her dad died in 1945, so he was traumatized in World War One and re-traumatized in World War Two when he saw the V1 and the V2 rockets, and he was there in Lewisham when a rocket exploded and left absolute carnage, and it just reminded him of what he saw in the trenches, and he ended up killing himself. He committed suicide, although it was hushed up in the family, but that's what happened. And my mom, I mean, these little fragments I pieced together over time, my mom realized to some extent what was going on, but just ignored it, let him get on and kill himself. And he may have been drunk, and he slit his wrists in the bath upstairs and bled to death. And my mum was downstairs just thinking, go to help. And again, over time, so just putting all the academic learning aside, I had the sense that this was a driver. So the reason I got into the Mankind Project was a lot to do with this. And it kind of, I don't understand too grandiose, but looking at healing that wound in terms of my relationship with my mom, in terms of my mom's relationship with her dad. I mean, he was obviously not alive, but these things I think live on in family consciousness. So a big reason I'm here today is my personal story, and to some extent that personal story is played out in my professional life.
Okay, thank you. I mean, already I can see how we're going to find our way in, because it seems when we talk about war, there's always kind of two elements really. There's the personal story, and then there's the wider kind of sociological story of the effect of war. And what really interested me when we were talking, when you did the talk, which was fantastic at the Union Chapel. I mean, it was, I don't think I'd ever seen it so quiet. Was this kind of idea that somehow at that time there was a shift. There was a shift and an effect that was caused by that war, which in many ways has never been healed even today. So maybe if you talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And I guess masculinity and war are very intertwined. We were chatting just before we went live, and when I interviewed Red Army veterans, many of them were women, and the idea that it's just men fighting war, you should meet some of these extraordinary women. There are over 1 million women fighting in the Red Army, one of the most savage wars in human history. And when the Germans found them and captured them, what happened was absolutely horrific. So, I just want to acknowledge that it's not entirely men, but nevertheless, you're absolutely right. Masculinity is tied up with war from Homer and the Iliad onwards, really. And I think World War One was a big deal because on a very deep level, it represented a betrayal. That there was a sense that as a man, one entered war in good faith to fight for one's country, to fight for one's family, to fight for one's mates. And of course, during World War One, there were the PALS battalions, and many of the war memorials in villages and towns that are so moving are these closely knit groups of men who fought together and died together. I think it was very difficult for many of them at the end of this horrific war to work out why they'd been fighting. You see the films of the liberation of the concentration camps at the end of World War II, and they're absolutely ghastly, but then it's quite clear why you were fighting. but World War One, I mean, it was almost like tiny, redrawing the map of Europe here and there. And was that really it? And what absolutely devastated my father were two things: the senseless slaughter. So there was a sense of betrayal during the war from the commanders, and there's a huge academic debate about this, were they that, but every veterans account that I've come across, and I know that for my own grandfather, they felt that lives were being needlessly wasted, and my grandfather was furious about the senseless loss of life. So there was a sense of betrayal, that men's lives were lost, and they shouldn't have been lost in that way. Sent out into no man's land, a mile to get to the enemy trench. The trenches hadn't been destroyed, and you're plodding across, and then wiped out by machine gun fire. Whole, masses of men. So in the course of the war, there was a sense of betrayal, and then at the end of the war, the promise to all those who got back was that it would be a land fit for heroes. And again, piecing together these fragments, but when my grandfather got back, John Patrick O'Reilly, he was in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he was an officer, he was a lieutenant, and he saw one of his fighting comrades in poverty in London, reduced to cleaning the boots of draft dodgers, fat city cats who'd use their connections to avoid fighting at all. And that summed it up for him. And it symbolizes for me a very deep betrayal. These men, so many brave men who died, were betrayed during the war and betrayed after it. And that my take on this is that has not healed, and we carry that pain generationally as men into the present day.
Yeah, because there was a line I remember which I remember you saying that talk, which really sat with me, and like took away with me, was that we had broken the agreement in the way that we had with young men, which was the agreement that at some stage we may ask you to die for this country, or to die for this community or this village, whatever it would have been coming out. And in that war, it was something else. It was something much more political. It wasn't a kind of
economic.
Made that trust. And you said that's never really been acknowledged or apologized for. And
no, absolutely. And in a way, I want to be very careful here. There's something very good about remembrance and Remembrance Sunday and honoring the dead. But it doesn't sit completely comfortably with me, because there's a part of that story, in my judgment, that's not being owned, which is that the capitalist class, and I have a political take on this. The capitalist class sent these men into war with a lie, that you're fighting for the good of your country, when actually they were fighting for the good of business interests, the colonists, this, that, and the other, and that's never been owned. And I think that a lie that's not owned and not addressed leaves a wound that doesn't heal. So in that sense, there is, I kind of wince a bit alongside, there's a lot that's good in the remembrance, but it feels to me incomplete. Perhaps that's the best way to put it.
I mean, there's also there's a definite kind of shift, isn't there, after World War One? I mean, there seems to be a definite shift, and being someone who's from London, and my ancestors always been from London, I know from the stories from father to son, is that, and by the research that I've done, that also at that time after World War one, there's a definite kind of rise in organized crime, especially in the UK. There seems to be this thing of and what you expect. It's like you bring a group of men together, you teach them how to organize into small battalions, how to fight. You promise them a land fit for heroes, and they come back and that's not there. So what they're going to do? Are they going to walk back to the factories? Are they going to go back to these men now have seen such horrific things and have been through such horrific things and have learned how to shut that part away and be able to still organize around that? That there seemed to be that seemed to almost be the inevitable thing that was going to happen. People were going to form their own armies. And it seems to me when I heard you talking at the Union Chapel, it seemed to me that almost became out of that betrayal.
Yeah, well,
That like we're going to step outside of this system now. If that system's going to do that to us, we're going to be outside of this system.
yeah, I think there are a lot. I mean, kind of causality is complicated in history, but one gets a sense of that. I mean, there were so many repercussions of that betrayal. It's so important, as we know, for men to tell their stories and have those stories heard, acknowledged, and honored. And yet, once one feels a sense of betrayal, that the loss of lives of one's friends was pointless, then it becomes very hard to share that story. And then often veterans wanted to quote unquote protect their families by not mentioning this. It was too painful, it was too difficult. But of course it sort of leaks out. It impacts enormously. And yes, you have the possibility then of using the skills acquired in war in a different way, and that's been seen in many people who work with gangs and gang psychology and the need to find peer group acknowledgement when one hasn't been properly acknowledged. Mm. So I think the big thing there is that a betrayal is the opposite of a blessing, and a lack of acknowledgement leads one to seek acknowledgement elsewhere. But also, I'm, this is a different topic, but if you're okay, I think one's also looking at intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And, it's just interesting, today I was kind of thinking, great, I'm chatting to Laurence and on this, Thursdays for Knowledge, but oh my God, Laurence hasn't sent me the link yet. And that started in the present. Just, okay, let's get that sorted. But what I noticed was that it was growing, so it was taking on a life of its own. And so I processed it, and I did a lot of work about 20 years ago with Kenneth McCall, who pioneered healing the family tree. And sometimes one gets the sense that what one has experienced is not trauma from one's own past, but trauma that has kind of attached itself to someone. It's almost like the energy of these experiences often attaches itself to people on an evolutionary path, because it's wanting attention, it's wanting healing. And there were so many experiences, particularly in World War One. I often had an experience when I'd be despairing, and this was kind of, in the early days of NKP or before MKP, and I noticed a particular pattern was playing out where I just think it's no use, I'm hopeless, no one notices me, just these bad things are going to keep happening. So what's the point? I'm going to kill myself. And it was very strong, but it was after a while I could kind of step back a little and witness this playing out. And I thought, this doesn't actually, it feels like it's attached itself to me rather than it. And then subsequently, when my mom and I did some healing work together around this, that she was able to talk more about it. And I realized that this was my grandfather killing himself. So, sort of drunk, confused, self-pity, trying to find the razor, no one cares, and I thought, my God, and I'm not saying that, but I just thought to myself that this anxiety around a deadline and, is the link going to work? I was reading before we talked about men waiting to go over the top. And there was a series of photographs. Actually, it was a book my late mom had kept. And you saw all these happy faces. They were going to France. They were going to fight the good fight. And they're so happy and proud. And then there's a photo of them in the trench. The whistle's about to blow. They're about to go over the top. And they're so anxious and worried and fearful. And then the third picture is of no man's land. And they've just been shelled to pieces. And you see all the bodies. But I thought to myself, I can't track this level of anxiety in a personal experience that I've had, but it fits so well with what my grandfather would have endured. So I'm just saying it's a kind of mindfulness thing, that trauma can be carried, I believe. So these are just my beliefs, but they're beliefs of others as well. And then they kind of reappear. And I think that's also a consequence of this betrayal and this unmet acknowledgement of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's when I think of war, it's one of those, it's one of those things where, like, sometimes I feel like I get a fleeting glimpse, right? And what I mean by that is like, it's very easy for things to become history, like to look at, whether it be Hastings or whether it be whatever battle it be, or the further we get away from World War One, and the further we get away from World War Two, things ultimately become mythology in a way. They kind of just become stories the further we get away from them. And then every now and again, when I'm thinking about them, I will get a sense of what must it have actually been like actually to kind of be there. Not on this sort of level of thinking it through and they would have come over, but actually, like, I'm sitting here waiting to go over to die, and when I go over, I'm going to see people be mowed down around me, really, in real life, not in some computer game, not in some film. Like, there's my friend, he's now dead, and the other side of it, I've got this gun, I've killed that person.
And that's a big deal, to actually, not kill someone by a remote controlled device. And this reappeared in the Falklands. Is why there's so much trauma with Falklands veterans, because you're actually bayoneting someone, and that war, had to be finished very fast, and in the mountains. And I talked to company commanders who were bayoneting people to death, and but on the other hand, the paradox is, when I was meeting Russian veterans and kind of thinking, oh my God, that's awful, Stalingrad veterans, these were communists and atheists talking about the spiritual experience, because they said, once you, and Stalingrad is probably one of the most awful battles in history, so I was astonished. They said, once you accepted that you could die, that life expectancy for the ordinary soldier was less than a day, everything started changing, and that material things, the whole materialism, they were communists anyway, but lost its grip. And I realized they were fighting totally in the present. This one veteran I got to know very well, and he became a general and commander of the Warsaw Pact later on. He was an extraordinary guy. He was fighting at one engagement. This was World War II, towards the end of World War II at Poznan. So this was a Polish city. And everything I'd read about this was a nightmare. It had been, the reconnaissance was poor, the Red Army collided with, SS who weren't supposed to be there, horrific street fighting. So I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry that you had to fight there. And he said, why are you so sorry? And I kind of backed off a bit, and I said, well, I heard it was a terrible battle. And he said, well, I tell you what it was like for me. I was 20, uh, and we went off and fought the Germans for a couple of hours, and then I found this very attractive Polish woman, and we had great sex, and then fought the Germans a bit more. Then we had a drink. What's there to dislike? And I, I didn't ever write that up for a number of reasons, and one of them was that it would be caricatured so much. But one of the truths about men and war is this exceptional bond with your fellow fighter, and as the veterans say, loving your fellow fighter as a warrior loves a fellow warrior, and also being absolutely in the present. And it's clear that it was a different world where the horror was large in the life, but also the beauty and just the astonishment of living. So in that sense, war is trauma, war is horror, and it has horrific consequences. But I was aware, working with veterans, that there are these moments where you also feel absolutely in the present, absolutely alive within that horror. And one of the impacts of war is that feeling you can never recapture in peacetime. So the amazing feeling of comradeship and everything being heightened goes, and is just replaced by something that doesn't recapture that.
Yeah, because that must be the other difficult part of being in a conflict situation, going through a war, is if you're lucky enough to survive. It's almost inconceivable to think what it must be like to go from that kind of intensity, and I hear that. So you've got these two elements. Yes, you've got the trauma, and because of that trauma, you've got the comradeship that you need to survive, and you've got the heightened sense of now and the lack of materialism, because none of that really matters. It's just life or death and now. How do you then bring that back to civilian street? Like, once you're then back and you're like, and your boss is like, right, come in and sit there and do that. How, I can't imagine how you can switch to that,
with great difficulty. I remember interviewing a Falklands veteran, and I wanted to ask him about a pretty horrific event, and this was when the Argentine invasion happened. So they were all expecting, there's a very small force of Royal Marines garrison, they're all expecting to be killed. And he was describing an engagement just outside Port Stanley, the Falklands capital, where they all shook hands because the unit saw all these armored carriers approaching, and there didn't seem any way they were going to escape. So I said, are you okay talking about this? And he said, fine. I mean, he was speaking from this up, because it's very powerful when the veteran drops into his or her sometimes entire body, because then the experience is embodied. But sometimes it's a coping mechanism, very understandable, to just kind of rehearse and repeat the story without dropping into it, because dropping into it is too horrible. But anyway, off we went, and he talked about it. It was very clear. And I said to him, how are you doing now? And he said, well, not great, actually. So I said, well, let's leave the military stuff aside. So what's happening for you? And he said, well, I can't hold work down. I've lost my family. And suddenly this whole thing opened up just like a floodgate. And he described a scene where he was strangling his wife to death with his kids watching, believing he was in a trench fighting against an Argentine soldier. And it happened that quickly. So there's a whole body of experience now. I mean, things have really shifted in the last few years about working with veterans and rehabilitation, and that's terrific, because it's really changed the parameters, and there's a lot of support. And he got support. I mean, often they don't feel entitled to ask for support, and you just hang out with your mates and there's kind of alcohol. That now veterans are reaching out, and there's some very good support. And one of the themes that's very powerful is having your story heard and honored, so that that being able to make peace with the past in a way, and that it's a phenomenally difficult thing to cross that bridge from fighting in a war in a military unit to living a civilian life. And often there is a part of a veteran that will be sealed off for the reasons you can see.
Yeah.
From a partner, from kids. But of course, everyone senses it. Whether it breaks out, whether it's triggered and breaks out, or whether it's coming out sideways. And I know, that things have changed, and that's great. But it is a huge challenge integrating.
Yeah. And I guess it shows that importance really of kind of, well, almost it's like sort of intersectionality in a way, isn't it? It's kind of like I would imagine if I'd been through something like that, the only people I could really be truly vulnerable or honest about the things I'd seen and done and felt would be with other people who I assumed had been through that same thing.
Yeah.
Had been through that same thing. And I think it's one of the things that I think it's one of the things that's really, really important that we are coming to learn as a society. I think that it's okay for smaller groups to get together and talk about what they need to talk about, because other people don't have a shared reference. There's no shared reference there.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the big question, and this ain't really a sort of historical question, really. So I'm just sort of asking it more on how what your sense is. But do you think that like are men or humans and war kind of inextricably linked? Is it just something that we do? Are we like the warring animal in a way? Because it seems to be so inherent in our history, so prevalent. Conflict. Can you see a time when we won't be?
But I would say that we like studying bad stuff.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it.
It's like the news. Stuff that's awful it'll be shown all over the place. But if something is inspiring, I'm writing a book on the beginning of World War II, and W.H. Auden, he wrote a very famous poem called 1st of September 1939, but I was using his diary, and he quite deliberately juxtaposed the kind of scary stuff that kind of indicated that war was on its way with the amazing stuff. So kind of 29th of August, so we're a couple of days off from the start of the awful World War II. And it's going to start, in the Polish city of Gdansk. For Germans, it was Danzig. And so he kind of noticed some sort of political, military, sort of scary bit of information, and then said, in Danzig today, doctors have discovered a device that may help cure something or other. And it was so interesting because it was juxtaposing the amazing side of humankind with the awful side, but it was quite unusual. So there have been periods where humanity, men, women, humanity have enjoyed remarkable peace, cohesion, coexistence, and we avoid them like the plague. And so we do like studying suffering and war, and of course it is an important part of our collective experience. But I'd address the question, why we always gravitate towards that when we could also study amazing times where we weren't fighting, when we were coexisting.
I wonder why that is. I mean, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? Because you mentioned our connection through MKP, and just because there might be people who are watching this who don't know about the Mankind Project. A men's organisation, and it's one that both me and Mike and a lot of people who end up on this have been involved. And one of the sort of key things I got from that really was the importance to kind of acknowledge the darkness in me so that I can have it out in front of me and know exactly where that is. And also the importance of actually celebrating the gold that's in me, celebrating the positive things that I can bring to the world and the balance and that. And what I'm getting from what you're talking about there is when we study things, when we look at history or we look at whatever we're looking at, there tends to be a kind of uh, a gravitation towards negative maybe or not such attractive features. And I find that very interesting because when I'm talking to men quite a lot, just generally, I will often say, like, if we sort of say, well, tell me, it's very interesting that as soon as you bring in truth, so if you say to a man, like, tell me the truth about you, 9 times out of 10 he'll sink a bit lower and come out with something that, oh, I'm dishonest, or I'm, rather than the other side of what he can be as well. And I find it's a very interesting thing to try and get men to try and see their positive and their negative in an equal light. It somehow, and this might just be my own stuff, somehow it's the same as a compliment. You know, if someone comes up to me and says, "You've done that terribly," I can believe that. If someone comes up and says, "That was fantastic, that thing you did," I think, all right, okay, yeah, I see what you're doing here. What is it you want? You know, I'm sort of much easier at taking negative stuff on than I am positive stuff. And I wonder if that's the trait that brings that out.
Yeah,
That,
yeah, in part that it's very important to be honest about the dark stuff that men have been involved in terms of violence in war and in society. But, you know, not to define oneself by that. And this is the power, I mean, in MKP, Laurence has been talking about is the power of mission. And, that it's what I aspire towards rather than what I, on a soul level, on a spiritual level, rather than what I've been hurt by, either individually or collectively. And of course, unmet wounds tend to replay in history. And we see wounds, in Ireland, and the Middle East that have hundreds and hundreds of years of pain of replaying again and again and again. But equally, there is, the saying, without a vision, a people perish, and indeed without a vision, a person perishes, which is, acknowledging the darker stuff, but aspiring towards. And if I keep dousing myself in negativity, then I'm kind of reinforcing a shadowy mission. So I do feel it's very important. I mean, this is, why the organization was called New Warrior, because it came out of the ashes of veteran experience in Vietnam, where that was another betrayal for them. And let's be honest about the atrocities and the awful things that happened, but also acknowledge that men went in there believing they were fighting for democracy and American values, found out that wasn't true, and there were some terrible consequences. And then they came back and were shunned because, the war had been rejected. And it's the same story. And I think that metaphor is to own the dark stuff, but then realign. And part of that realigning is through the power of listening, the power of story, the power of acknowledgement, the power of healing, but then also aspiring to a vision that's different. That in a way, acknowledging the dark allows one powerfully and purposefully to reach for the light. And I'd like to embed that with just one example. So I knew a lot of veterans, Russian veterans, who at the time, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we could have blown the world up, they were on the Politburo. One person I knew quite well was head of strategic bombing, head of the Warsaw Pact, and I knew them well enough because I knew that 2 days into the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and the Americans were saying, we're losing the plot. I mean, we're spiraling into fear. And someone quoted Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher and general, who said that battles are won in the temple, not on the field of combat. And I mentioned this to these Russian veterans, and they said, well, that's very interesting, because on the second day we felt exactly the same. The whole Politburo left the Kremlin, stood by the flame of the fallen warrior, thinking of 27 million soldiers and civilians who sacrificed their lives. And they asked themselves this question: did those brave people sacrifice their lives so we could blow the world up? And both sides around day 2 realigned towards a vision of cooperation rather than conflict. And it took tremendous courage, and it was partly a spiritual path. But as a result of that, we're here to have this conversation, because we, in terms of the clock that is up to near midnight, we were the closest to destroying our planet. And it was very powerful talking to people on the Russian side who were responsible for either, sending out the bomb or not. So I would say that what I saw and what I believe in is that the horror of war can also empower a profound wish to heal and to commemorate the sacrifice of others by creating a better world for everyone.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, one thing I'm really interested in at the moment is that, like, I feel in many ways that's a little bit where kind of masculinity has kind of come, in a way. Really, there's questions being asked, and I believe we're at a stage where we're having to kind of look at some of those questions, like, what is it I stand for? What is the vision? Where are we going to go from here? What are the changes that need to be made? But what I like about what you're saying from there is there's the part of acknowledging the bad, acknowledging the good, but also that thing about kind of blessing, in a way, like it to be acknowledged as men, of where we've been, and to have a clear vision of where we want to go.
Yeah.
Because that's I feel where we are. I do feel that masculinity is being redefined at these moments. There's a lot of talk at the moment about, everywhere there's a kind of talk about masculinity at the moment. You do a Google search, and you just put in the word masculinity, nothing comes up that's very positive at the moment. And I believe all of that really is, my personal view is that we're being asked to be reinitiated, in a way, really. So what does it mean now? Where are we going to go now? What does it mean now to be men in the 21st century? But what I can't get away from is that we're not going to get anywhere unless we kind of admit these parts that have happened in our history, because the wars that we've been fought, like we said at the beginning, have kind of put such a there's so many intergenerational scars from those wars. There's so many untold stories, and there's so little acknowledgement, really, especially for later wars, that how do we do that healing process, I guess, is what I'm saying. How do we, is it something that we have to do individually, to heal those wounds, to heal that, or is there something we can do collectively to kind of heal heal the wounds of betrayal?
Right. These are huge questions. And we're also at our kind of time limit. I think to be mindful, I mean, in our rituals, we call in the energy of the ancestors. I sometimes wonder what we're imagining when we do that, because our ancestors fought in war and often were left traumatized, and we're kind of saying, "Hi guys, yeah, you're welcome to drop by." I think it has to be more conscious, to connect with members of our family who fought in World War I or World War II. And my dad fought in Burma against the Japanese, and you don't forget that in a hurry. And again, the impact of that was colossal on me. I thought I was walking around or in a minefield because the anger, the explosions of anger, and I think part of it. I think what I'd like to do, Laurence, is to answer this question very personally by my mum and I went to my grandfather, my mum's dad's grave. We found it was broken and smashed. So that can be a metaphor. No one had cared for it. My mum had showed up in 1945, just kind of saying good riddance. And then it had been left. The headstone was smashed to pieces, and we found it, repaired it, and then we had a ceremony. And I'd like to. My mum died a couple of years ago, and I found this. So this was what she said, and it's very brief. And I'd like to use that as an example to answer your question. So these are the words of my mum on Sunday, the 12th of October, 1997. And she said, "We are gathered here together to offer a prayer for the soul of John Patrick O'Reilly. We hope and pray that his soul now rests in peace. We are truly sorry that he did not live long enough to know and enjoy his grandchildren, who are thinking of him today. Sadly, it is only in recent years that we have become more fully aware of the horrors undergone by those who served as he did in the First World War, and especially the carnage at Passchendaele, the Battle of Passchendaele. Nor did we really understand the misery he felt for the rest of his life because of it. We now realize that his behavior afterwards, which caused us, his immediate family, such distress, was influenced by this post-war trauma. For my part, I would like to say that the hardness I felt in my heart towards him at the time of his death, and when I last stood at this graveside, is no more. And I can only pray that he now rests truly at peace." And I feel that these are the journeys of healing that individually and collectively are so important to undertake.
Thank you, Mike. I think let's finish it there. That seems like the perfect place to finish it. There are three questions I will ask, which I ask everyone though. One is, where can people keep in contact with what you're up to?
Well, I have a website, so it's michaeljoneshistorian.com. I haven't updated it for a little while because it's been difficult to do very much, but I will be. So it's www, and then no punctuation breaks, just michaeljoneshistorian.com. So I have a website, and yeah.
Right. And what book has had the most effect on your life?
Well, it's awful to say a book that I wrote, but I am going to say it. A book I wrote on the Battle of Stalingrad, because that book was. I've been to that city. I've lived in that city, and I actually feel it's embedded itself in me. And I got to know many of the veterans as friends, the Russian veterans, and then I got to know German veterans through the book, because they said, thank you, we wondered what really happened, how our opponents changed and fought so amazingly. So that book was a deeply personal experience, and I was kind of impelled to write it. So that the experience behind that book is the most important thing in my life. I'm just going to say that.
Okay. And last question: if you could meet yourself as a teenager, what's the one bit of advice you'd give yourself, knowing that you may not listen to it?
I'd say, bless you, love yourself, try not to be so hard on yourself, and trust the journey.
Great. Thank you. So thank you, Mike. It was lovely to spend time with you. As I said, every time we meet, we end up saying it's been too long. So hopefully it won't be next time. But thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight with us, and also for sharing so much vulnerability with us. I really appreciate it. I'm really, really touched by it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for coming on, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Bye.
Take care.